It's time for The Verdict. The Verdict is a lively discussion of current events and legal issues pertinent to Oklahomans. The Verdict is hosted by Kent Myers and Mick Cornett. It's time for The Verdict.
And welcome once again to The Verdict. I'm Mick Cornett, and I am joined, as always, by one of Oklahoma's top legal experts, Kent Myers. And Kent, today a special guest.
Special guest, our Lieutenant Governor, Mary Fallin, will be joining us here in just a minute. And we're going to be talking about Oklahoma's position in the space race. Believe it or not, there is still a space race going on. Some of us remember it from the early 60s and President Kennedy's mandate to get the space program going. And the fervent activity that took place after that to put a man on the moon and other accomplishments. But then it's kind of faded from the picture somewhat, and Oklahoma is at the forefront of trying to revive it for a number of reasons. There's a lot more going on in this state about outer space than most of us realize, and we're going to hear about it.
And we're going to have Lieutenant Governor Mary Fallin on to discuss that and maybe another topic or two. But we're going to take a look at Oklahoma's role in the aerospace industry. It's coming up next on The Verdict. Welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers is going to introduce our guest.
Once again, we're pleased to have the Honorable Mary Fallin, the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Oklahoma, join us again for her fourth appearance on The Verdict. Lieutenant Governor Fallin is the first female and first Republican elected Lieutenant Governor in Oklahoma, and she is serving in her third term. She was raised in Tecumseh, a graduate of Oklahoma State University, served a period in the Oklahoma House of Representatives, and is chairperson of two very important task forces dealing with aerospace in Oklahoma and in the United States, and probably is as much on top of this issue as any person in the United States. And we are lucky enough to have her in this state, and luckier still to have her join us again on The Verdict. Thank you.
Always good to be with you.
We appreciate it.
Seems to me when we're talking aerospace, we're talking jobs. How many jobs are we talking about in this state?
Well, of course, Oklahoma's had a rich history in aviation. You go back to Wally Post, when he was the first person to solo around the world from Oklahoma. And, of course, our long history of all the great companies that are located in Oklahoma in aviation, from the Boeings to the American Airlines to the FAA centers, the Tinker Air Force Base, the Vance Air Force Base,
Altus Air Force Base,
NORDAM, all those great companies. So in Oklahoma, we have a lot of jobs that are created by the aviation industry, 143,000 as a matter of fact, and we have over 350 companies that are in the aviation aerospace business. So it's important to our economy.
What kind of payroll does that generate, just approximately?
Oh, well, approximately $4.7 billion in payroll in Oklahoma, exactly what it creates. And actually, in industrial output and services and products, it's over $11 billion. So it's very important to our economy.
And there's tax revenue involved in all of that.
Tax revenue, okay, you want to go into that? $77 million in state income tax revenue.
How much?
$77 million.
Wow.
And $60 million.
That is a lot.
$60 million in sales tax revenue. And of course, we need all the revenue we can get right
Hear,
now.
hear.
A little bit of budget shortfalls in our state. So.
Well, how did you first get interested in paying close attention to the space industry or the aviation industry in Oklahoma?
Well, probably a little bit of personal interest. I'm about 3 hours away from my pilot's license, so a little bit of that.
Yeah.
But actually, I belong to a group called the Aerospace States Association, which is a national organization that has delegates appointed by governors and lieutenant governors, and they meet quarterly in Washington, D.C., and I was asked last fall to be the national chairman of that group. And our organization meets to discuss federal policy, state policy as it relates to aviation and space. We talk about legislation, we promote education, within our grade schools and our high schools and higher education institutions, because we need to educate the workforce to take those kinds of jobs. We also promote research and development. And we actually do some grant proposals in which we have scientists who will study specific issues and issue reports back to the federal government.
Where does Oklahoma rank along with other states? How high up the ladder are we in the aerospace industry?
Well, of course, you got California and you got Florida and Texas. They have some of the spaceports. Alabama has a spaceport. Alaska has a spaceport. Colorado's very involved in aviation. And Oklahoma is trying to become actually the first state, if possible, to land a spaceport at Burns Flat, Oklahoma, which has the longest, one of the longest runways in the whole world.
Out by Clinton.
It used to be the old Clinton Sherman Air Force Base, and it's an asset for Oklahoma that's not being utilized. And of course, they have the hangars and the buildings and the great runway. And so we actually been working on that for many years through the Oklahoma Space Industry Development Authority to try to lure companies that might develop space vehicles that would go up and do what's called suborbital launches, in which you take off from one location on the Earth and you suborbit the Earth and land at another location. And right now in the United States, there is no state that has an inland launch. You may launch from a coast in Florida or California or down the Texas coastline, but you don't launch inland in a state.
And what about Oklahoma makes it particularly desirable, perhaps, from that standpoint?
Well, we have 330 days of visual flying is one thing. We have good weather in Oklahoma. We have a central location. We have the asset of the runway itself, and then we have, as I said, a rich history of aviation companies that are located here, along with major military bases with the Air Force.
Now, I know that you are the national chairperson of the Aerospace States Association, but Oklahoma has another delegate with some space and aviation credentials. Can you tell our viewers who that is?
General Tom Stafford has been very active in that group, and another gentleman named Bob Triplett out of Tulsa is actually the national treasurer of the group. So we have two Oklahomans that are running the show up in Washington, D.C.
Well, as far as traveling into outer space, what is the future of that for the United States, do you feel like? Are we doing more of that, or are we going to do less of that in the future?
That is a tremendous question, because just 2 weeks ago, I held a forum on Capitol Hill with several of our congressmen who are chairman and vice chairman of the Space Technology Committees, and I invited Sean O'Keefe, who is the administrator of NASA, and it was quite a coup to get him to come because he's a very busy man. But he came along with I think we had about 15 participants, and I was the moderator of the forum, and we talked about America's vision for space. Where do we go from here? After the crash of the spaceship Columbia and some of the other tragedies that we've had in our space program, America is looking at where do we want to go in space, and do we want to continue in research and development? Do we want to continue to send people up in space? So we've been talking about that and actually helping Congress and the President draft policy to talk about what our vision should be as a nation.
Where do you sense that going? Do you sense that the vision or the commitment to space development is going to go forward, or is it pretty stalled, or where do you see it?
I think it has been had some cold water on it just because of the tragedy we experienced. And of course, you know, what I heard in the testimony is that there's been tremendous benefits from space exploration. You know, like our GPS systems, our cell phones, our pagers. You know, medical research has been done. The weather systems. We've done some tremendous weather forecasting because of going up into space and doing research, which definitely affects Oklahoma with our tornadoes and even hurricanes on the coastal states. So there's some tremendous benefits from space exploration, but we want to make sure that it's financially feasible, that it is something that will benefit the nation as a whole, and that it's as safe as it could be. And so we're looking at all those different issues.
Do we need to justify, do we have to have a reason for going into space financially, or is the old space race concept to be able to discover and seek new planetary boundaries? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think man's imagination and man's quest for knowledge beyond what's outside our borders as an Earth it will always be there, I believe. But you know, there are a lot of people who say that once we reached the moon and we walked on the moon, that we lost our national passion, our national vision for space, and it's time to develop a new vision for that. And so we're still searching for that new vision.
I noticed recently that China is getting ready to launch an expanded program to try to reach the moon. and to send Chinese astronauts to the moon. And they are apparently making a greater commitment than has been true in the past.
Well, that's a good point, because one of the reasons why we went to the moon in the first place was to beat the Russians.
Right.
Remember the Cold War? We were trying to beat the Russians to the moon, and that became a national passion with President Kennedy in the 60s, and we did that. So we're searching for that new national passion.
Let me jump in here and get us to a break. We're visiting with Lieutenant Governor Mary Fallin, talking about aerospace in Oklahoma, and you're watching The Verdict. Mick Cornett and Kent Myers back on The Verdict. This week's guest is Lieutenant Governor Mary Fallin, and we're discussing Oklahoma's role in the aerospace industry and some other topics.
What's the state of Oklahoma doing? We know that the Aerospace States Association is active with you as the chairperson nationally. Does Oklahoma have some efforts ongoing as well?
You bet we do. Last April, we formed an aerospace task force in which I am chairing, and we started bringing together all the industry leaders, both in the private sector, the government leaders like Tinker Air Force Base. We brought together the universities, University of Oklahoma, Oklahoma State University, our career tech systems, and we pulled all the players together, and we started talking about what can we do to strengthen our position as a state so we can better compete with other states.
So we could shorthand it by saying the space race has changed from being U.S. versus the Soviet Union to now a race between the states for the space dollar.
You bet. And you might remember that Tulsa just had a major vote on a proposition, that Vision 2025, to help secure American Airlines, because they were thinking about leaving Oklahoma and possibly moving to Fort Worth or some other state. And of course, we didn't want to lose those jobs. That's a big maintenance repair facility in Tulsa. And then we're also bidding on the new Boeing 77 aircraft, and we still haven't heard word on that. And then we're always talking about whether we can secure Tinker, and if we might go through the BRAC Commission, and Tinker and Altus and Enid Air Force bases, and what our position is on that. So we formed a task force to really focus on Oklahoma's aviation industry, which we talked about its importance in our economy, and also look at our strengths or weaknesses and how we can better secure that industry. Look at some of the lessons that we've learned from companies that almost left, like American Airlines or the Boeing facility, or even Tinker Air Force Base.
You've mentioned some goals that are short-term, some seem to be long-term. What are the priorities of the task force?
Well, the priorities of the task force is that we're going to have a report out this month, and the report will basically outline what we can do to better position ourselves within the aerospace industry, looking at whether it's tax laws, whether it's federal rules and regulations, whether it's incentive packages, whether it's looking at our workforce and how we can better prepare the workforce to meet the needs of the demands of the industry. One of the statistics I heard recently was that in our military bases, that about 60% of the workers in the military bases are 4 years away from retirement age. And if they all retire and we don't have students coming up with engineering, computer, technology, math, science degrees to take those positions, those jobs will relocate to another state if we don't have the workforce. So how can we prepare our workforce? Looking at our assets within our state, how can we best leverage the assets, not only the intellectual capital within our state, and we have, like Dr. Shirley that's at OU, she was involved in the space rover
I've
program.
read that book, yeah.
Yeah, and she's a great asset for Oklahoma. Looking at our physical assets, the companies, the Boeings, the Nordams, the Rolls-Royce, the American Airlines, the Air Force bases themselves and the research and the building that they do. How can we leverage those assets and know what we have?
I read with interest some material you furnished in preparation for the show, and there was an acronym called SWOT, SWOT analysis, that this task force is carrying out. Can you tell our viewers what that is?
You bet. Well, one of the things we decided was that we really needed to get out to the companies and get out to the universities and career techs and talk to them and let them tell us what they need and what they see in the future. And look, not only next year, but 5, 10, 20 years down the line as to how we can prepare Oklahoma. So we divided our state into 3 different regions. We invited the private sector of the government and universities and career techs to come together, and we did what's called a SWOT analysis: strengths of the industry, weaknesses of the industries, opportunities for Oklahoma, and what are our threats within the industry. And so we actually just compiled a list of all those strengths, opportunities, and threats, weaknesses, and we now know, where do we need to improve upon in our state? What's the threats to Oklahoma? Our threat a couple of months ago was that American Airlines, was looking at leaving the state of Oklahoma. It's always a threat to make sure we're prepared for BRAC considerations with the Air Force bases. The opportunities are that we have tremendous maintenance repair organizations in our state, facilities within our states. AAR does a lot of repair out at Rear Rogers Airport. You have American Airlines with their repair facilities. We have good incentive programs within our state. We have good labor force. We have good career techs. What's all the opportunities and the strengths that we have that we can build upon to, secure our base?
What's the future of the aerospace industry? Obviously, we think it's going to continue to improve to supply more jobs. That's why you feel so strongly about going after them?
Well, of course, we're always going to have air transportation and the future in aerospace. And one of the things we've been talking about nationally is the air system itself. As you have, the GPS systems, global positioning systems, get the technology down here for you, global positioning systems, as airlines become more modernized, where they can, fly with automatic pilots and all the things that we have these days, new technology, systems change as you fly. And even if we go into suborbital space, one of the things we've been talking about is if you get above 60,000 feet, you're going into space. And so how do you control the airlines that are going below the space and the air traffic control? And then once we get suborbital launch vehicles that go above the 60,000, who controls that airspace? You got 2 different airspace that you're trying to put vehicles up in. So it's an interesting discussion, but what we do know is that there's new technologies, there's new inventions, there's new products and services that come out of the aviation industry, and it still has a great future ahead of it.
The Concorde used to fly at basically twice the speed, I guess, of the average commercial airliner, and they're just now mothballed it. They've just now taken it off the market.
Thing.
Is that a step backward for us? Is that a setback for people who want to see suborbital flight or commercialization of suborbital flight?
Well, I hate to see the Concorde go out of business, but of course they had some difficulties and a terrible tragedy within itself, and markets just change. The need changes, the demand changes, and of course it's a very expensive airplane to fly, and I think that we'll just see new inventions that will come up. There's lots of talk about future spacecraft, or I guess you'd say, maybe you ought to call them aircraft, that we will fly ourselves, in the future. That maybe people will have their own little airplanes that they fly from place to place. That's kind of dreaming, but it's what's out there. There's also talk that there are companies who will take people into suborbital space flight, and in fact, there's a bunch of people that have paid $100,000 deposit to be that first person that goes up into suborbital launches as tourists. And that's a new market that seems to be on the horizon.
Governor, congratulations on your position nationally on this issue. Your enthusiasm is contagious, and we appreciate your efforts.
So you want to put your $100,000 down?
I don't know. I'm going to have to think about that one. Lieutenant Governor Mary Fallin. Kent and I'll be back with a few final thoughts in a minute. Mick Cornett and Kent Myers back to wrap up another edition of The Verdict.
Well, as always, we are really thrilled to have Lieutenant Governor Fallin on with us. I think our viewers enjoy hearing what she has to say. And today we introduced a topic of the space race intra-United States, if you will, because now Oklahoma's in a race with other states to get the jobs, the education, the technology, and the economic activity that will come from the aerospace industry, even more so than we have in the past. Oklahoma has a surprisingly rich tradition in this industry, and the Lieutenant Governor has a very prestigious national position, the most prestigious national position in this area, and that will show benefits to Oklahoma for in the short term and the long term. So we're real pleased to be able to bring that. Now, next week we've got an equally interesting subject, because we're going to have a little debate between Brenda Renaud Wynn, the Labor Commissioner of the state of Oklahoma, and State Representative John Treblecock on whether or not the Labor Commissioner's position and the Insurance Commissioner's position ought to be appointed rather than elected. Representative Treblecock is planning to, along with Representative Dan Bourne, to introduce a bill to make those positions appointed rather than elected. And the two guests will not be agreeing on a lot, and we think our guests will become informed and be entertained at the same time.
Well, as always, we invite you to our website, theverdict.tv. Go there, look at our topics. Tell us if you've got an idea for a future show that you'd like to see. Also, if you'd like more information on Lieutenant Governor Mary Fallin or her interest in space, you can go to her website, which is LTGOV, that's Lieutenant Governor, ltgov.state.ok.us. Thanks again to our guest, Lieutenant Governor Mary Fallin. For Kent Myers, I'm Mick Cornett. We'll see you next time on The Verdict.